Hi, good morning. My name is Caroline Rybar, and I'm from the great class of 2009. And it's my pleasure to have so many of you here. I'm thrilled to introduce this session, the faculty debate on gender quotas, which I think will be fascinating. And I'm delighted to welcome our panelists, Shivaram Rajgopal, the Roy Bernard Kester, and T.W. Byrnes Professor of Accounting and Auditing. I'm definitely using notes for these titles. Jiang, the Arthur F. Byrnes Professor of Free and Competitive Enterprise, and Bruce Kogut, the Sanford C. Bernstein & Co. Professor of Leadership and Ethics. We look forward to their remarks on this timely issue. I was honored to be asked to introduce this panel because Columbia has meant so much to me professionally and personally, and in particular, the network of Columbia women alums. When I was applying for my internship at Deloitte, it was an alumna who had graduated a few years prior who really pulled me aside and helped make sure that I was ready for case day. And when it was time to leave Deloitte, one of my cluster mates, Arlen Davich, she had gone through the greenhouse program and was one of the two winners in my graduating class. She hired me away to be her VP of partner development. And she was the one who really connected me, who reminded me of the power of the Columbia network and that I should engage not just with my classmates, but really also with the school. And when it was time for that startup journey to end, it was yet another Columbia alumna who helped introduce me to my current role at Bionic, which is another startup in New York, where I'm now the chief operating officer. So, when I think about my path since graduation, it's really been paved for me by other women who took the time to help me move ahead. And so when Isaac reached out to talk about this idea they had for founding the Columbia Business School Women's Circle, I was thrilled not only to join, but to be one of the founders, one of 17 founders. The network has been such an instrumental part of my life that it was really important for me to be able to pay it forward to the women who will come after me. So I'm thrilled to have you all here today. I'm thrilled to have our panelists, and I will get to the good stuff.
Good morning. My name is Shiva Rajgopal, and I'm the Kester and Byrnes Professor of Accounting and Auditing at the B School here. I also serve as the Vice Dean of Research. So we've never done this before, so don't expect a Broadway production, but it'll be fun. So just want to set the stage for the discussion today. So on September 30th, 2018, California became the first US state to introduce a mandatory gender-based quota for all firms headquartered in California. You already have these quotas in place in Norway, Belgium, Germany, Spain, India, Israel. And needless to say, these quotas have been controversial. On the one hand, if you look at the data and if you look at the glacial pace of change, it'll probably take 40 years before we see some kind of parity in the boardroom in terms of gender. And I personally know of many women who are eminently qualified but have had a hard time getting on boards. On the other hand, you could say that the market left to its own devices will probably take care of this problem. And maybe the real issue is something else. Maybe it's women dropping off from the workforce 5 years after childbirth, and that's been robustly documented. So we have two distinguished colleagues of mine to hash this out. Wei is the Arthur Byrnes Professor of Free and Competitive Enterprise and the Vice Dean for Curriculum and Instruction at the B School. And as her title of the chair suggests, she's going to be arguing against quotas. And Bruce Kogut, who also happens to be my neighbor, is the Sanford Bernstein Professor of Leadership and Ethics. Bruce's teaching and research covers governance, corporate ethics. Both of them are highly accomplished people. And Bruce in particular has 70,000 Google citations, meaning there are 70,000 people who cite his work. I'd be grateful if 10 people on the planet read what I do. This is not to say that, Wei is an incredible person as well. So each of my colleagues will have about 8 to 10 minutes to make their case. And this would be followed by a response, if you will, to the other's position. We'll leave about half an hour for taking questions. We also have, I think, an online forum where I'm sure we're going to get a lot of questions. So without further ado, Wei.
I'm so grateful that you come because obviously you care for this important question. Now, if I were a litigation lawyer, I would be practicing what's called zealous advocacy, meaning at the outset, I'm assigned to one side, and I will do my best to defend that side to help win. But this is not the case. What I will argue is my true, authentic belief. Okay? So despite Professor Bruce and I are opponents in this debate, I'm quite sure that we are in agreement for the ultimate goal of this debate, which is to promote board diversity as well as diversity along many, many other dimensions. And we are also in agreement about the benefits and importance of board diversity, and most importantly, it improves the quality of the decision making, especially by avoiding blind spots. And it's also important that it will motivate and recruit the best talent from the widest possible pool. And in that part, we're in no disagreement. Now, the disagreement we have and we will debate on is whether the gender quota is the best or even a good device to accomplish this goal. So I will talk from three different aspects. One is I will show some data to see where we were and where we are, why changes are necessary. And second, I will argue why gender quota per se is not going to work, and in fact, it will most likely backfire. And finally, I also want to be constructive. If I'm not in favor of gender quota, then what are the alternative effective mechanisms that I will recommend? So let's start with some facts. Okay. Now, as recent as 10 years ago, women actually only represent fewer than 10% of the board seats. Now, in recent years, there has been some quite improvement in the right direction, going the north direction. Now we are north of 15%. Okay? But it's not enough. Why it's not enough? One is still lag behind most of the OECD countries, especially those in Europe. And second, I got the most recent data showing that women are 56% of the college grads, 59% of the master degree holders, and 54% of doctoral degree holders. So if you talk about a qualification, it is there. Okay, so those numbers don't reflect those new developments. Now, another positive improvement is that if you look at the newly added directors to the board, then last year 20% were women. And if you look at Fortune 500 or S&P 500, they're all on north of 35%. So the more prominent the companies are, the more effort and resources they put into this important endeavor. There's a huge variation in the industry, and it's not too surprising along the clothing, personal products, consumer products, there are more women, and the mine, energy, oil industry, construction, et cetera, there are a few women on the relative scale. But things are also start to blend up. Now, I find this to be particularly encouraging. This is the proportion of unisex boards. Okay? It used to be close to half, which is quite alarming. Think about 50% of the population are women and so many educated, qualified women. However, what is encouraging is that in just the last 3 years, those boards took a dramatic precipitous dip. And clearly, the publicly listed company took the lead. So Shiva mentioned that this progress has been at the glacial pace, and I think the glacial pace is more like the glacial pace on Greenland in global warming. So it is happening. Okay. Okay, so these are the numbers that I set the stage. And we come to the term that changes are necessary. And decision makers and executives cannot take more excuses. They must have a sense of urgency to march toward the goal of equity and parity. Okay? So then I come to the term why I don't think the gender quota is good. And I think the most commonly discussed factor is the tokenization. You probably all know about it. Okay? So I did have received inquiries from organizations say, gee, we need a senior woman. Are you interested? Okay, so certainly I don't feel happy about when I receive such an invitation. Okay? Now, if women are invited to the board by the explicit reason of their gender, then you cannot expect their colleagues to treat them with equity, even though they come with equal or even higher qualification. their own confidence might also suffer because they know they come in, take certain accomplishment because of some preferential selection. And there has been research show that people who come in to the doors through some preferential or separate selection, then they are more likely to be marginalized in discussions and decision makings because they're somewhat still treated as outsiders. So the research that follow those European practices in Italy, in France, Germany, Norway, that shows that after the gender quota in various strictness of mandatory forms, is that women are at the table, but they don't quite still break the ceiling. They're invited on the board, but they are still less likely, in the likelihood, relative likelihood sense, to become the chairpersons of the key committees or just committees at all, okay? And also another interesting finding is that despite more women on the board, somehow women make to the senior executive rank haven't been followed suit as the policies would have expected. And these are the common issues we talk about, but there's an issue that let's talk about is that I think that in the US, I'm not a legal expert, but I certainly learned from my law colleagues that gender quota per se is a legal challenge, at least subject to questioning of legal, if not challenge. Because we do have a clause called equal protection for everybody. So somebody cannot be deprived because with gender quota, you can certainly come up with a circumstance that a highly qualified man will be deprived of his equal opportunity because one company happened to be slightly below the gender quota and is obligated to fill the next member with a woman. Okay? Now, finally, a last thing I want to talk about is that I fundamentally feel that treating anyone not as an individual, but as a member of the group the person is affiliated with, especially when affiliation to the group is not a choice, is just fundamentally wrong. Okay, so this has nothing to do with whether women join the board will be better or worse for the bottom line or the profitability, etc. But I think this concept per se is fundamentally wrong. Suppose we want a diverse board, which is the common goal. Okay? If a board member, existing member, nominating committees, senior executives, if they're open-minded, they explore all possible pools, then the resulting nomination would on itself be diverse. Okay? And if a female board member director joins the board, it's because of the special skill or the personality that she embodies. It could be correlated her being a woman, but it's not because her being a woman. So that is the fundamental principle that we want to uphold. And in fact, the quota advocates are against treating women, given the group they belong to. Then it cannot do something that's against in its own face. Now, let me try to be constructive. What could be the alternative mechanism? I can think about three things. One is the SEC sunshine model. Okay, I can give an example. In 2015, the SEC asked all companies to disclose the pay ratio, which is the ratio of the CEO compensation to the median worker pay in that company. There's no new information because CEO compensation has always been disclosed. However, the ratio was not put to spotlight before this regulation. After the regulation, we no longer see the ratio 500, which was quite common in the early 2000s. We saw the pay package, $125 million, etc. Those pay packages disappear because you simply cannot stand in front of the public to say that your pay, the CEO pays 500 times your average worker in the company. Now, the median is 100. We can also ask company or force company, mandate company to disclose the number of female directors, the number of people of color on the board, etc., along many, many dimensions. And those unisex board would be named and shamed, and I believe, as it already have shown, will be very, very powerful. Now, we also need to look at the problem into the more at the outset. Okay? So I think all companies, all large organizations, schools, we need to do a more careful auditing because at the college graduation is gender parity. Okay? And by the time it's CEO, In the Fortune 500, it is fewer than 5%. That implies there must be, at some step in the funneling process, there's a dramatic imbalanced attrition rate against women. And we need to find out which steps they are and how do we help to mitigate the differential attrition rate between men and women. That is a long-term, it's a long-term approach rather than setting the goal, setting the agenda, tomorrow we hit the number, we are all fine, okay? And finally, yes, my chair professor is called Free and Competitive Enterprise. I do have a fundamental belief in that market is ultimately the best place to guide as well as to disseminate best practice. Because the market is not the market per se. When we think about the market, we think about buying and selling stock. That's not the simple market I have in mind. When I say market, we also have stock analysts. We have consultants. We have large institutional investors who can withhold their votes on the board election if the board is clearly non-diverse for no good reason. Okay? Now, all these forces could be in at work, and when we put the company in the spotlight, when they clearly have a problem, they will have to behave, or at least outline the route to change. So I think I will just stop here. Thank you. I already run over.
First of all, thanks to all of you for coming and to people who put this together. I know how hard the alumni club leaders have worked, and also faculty and staff have worked. And the idea, I think, sprung up maybe with a conversation with Gita Johar and Shivaram Rajgopal to do this. And I think it's a great idea to do this. And I hope you feel better. You know, you're back in class a little bit, but it's really your time to. I mean, you did arrive late, so you obviously are feeling at home. But you're back in class, so you can raise some issues as we go along. So I believe in capitalism too, and free enterprise. Your self-selection to a business school should tell you that. I also have the chair, which is leadership and ethics. I do have a fiduciary obligation to that title, and I roughly do believe in that there is an argument for quotas, which I'll explain to you as we go along. So I don't mind picking up this particular charge. I worked at NCI before, where I did do ethics for the MBA orientation. I've taught governance here and there as well. And Europe, I was involved, I lived in Europe for quite some time, and I was involved with boards, either on corporate advisory, whatever it was, in a number of countries, and also in India as well, where I was on a corporate board. And the number of women were really quite low overall, and that was where we started out from. And Norway too, which is this great Scandinavian country, was quite low when they made the decision back in 2005 to start addressing this particular issue. But I will say something, and is that even though women were minorities on boards, at the same time, they had generally they had very important voices. It wasn't as if the women were shy and were not, in my experience, on this. And I remember we ran a conference back when I was running the Bernstein Center. We had and there was some averages given out. On average, women are more shy in negotiations. On average, women are this and that. And then the woman who spoke from industry said, "That's great, but the women who get nominated to boards are not average. They're not average. These are people who actually can speak up and hold their own." And I think that's important to keep that in mind. Now, I'm going to make a statement that you can't argue against facts. So I'm going to say that they are irrelevant to the overall argument. I know that seems a bit odd, but things are improving, that's for sure. But there's really not an discussion about whether or not the things are getting better. It really is about, is there a role for quotas in helping this particular problem? And this is more of a normative issue than an issue about empirical facts, which I think is important. It's not about efficiency, and I think Jiang spoke very well to that. This study is saying that you've been hurt. Studies which say you've done well. Most of the finance studies do tend to be more in the direction of it hurts on that, or at least you find those studies, whereas other literatures don't find them too much. And I think there's been some amazing studies which actually have in finance which have discussed this. But really the issue before me, at least in thinking about this problem, is there a problem with social justice? When you see boards which have 0 women on the boards, or just 1 woman on the boards, you may call it tokenism, we have 1 woman on the boards, but that's exactly the problem, is why we only have 1 woman on the board in the first place, and where are you actually going to start? And we could argue from points of efficiency that that markets are better and the unconstrained choice of boards should be allowed. But that's not, again, not addressing the problem that in most people's eyes in a society, when they look at boards of the most powerful corporations in the country, it cannot be tenable that there's only one and sometimes often zero a woman on the board itself. Now, when boys and girls are born, and this is why gender is particularly interesting, they are born with equal probability into a family. And they are born with equal influence from their parents. They're born into the equal socioeconomic status of their family. They should have equal chances, you would think, at birth to be as successful as each other. And that's the violation which is true. And you're absolutely right. Even when we find at college equality now in numbers, there's not even more women there, it is odd that you don't find the numbers on boards. And yet we find already that half the doctors, half the lawyers in the country who are coming out are female. And business school is still doing much better, but we're still struggling on this particular issue. And then the data done elsewhere, if you want to talk about data, shows that there's a high rate of attrition among women, which Shiva alluded to. And there are reasons maybe later we'll come back and talk about this as well. So I find it amazingly powerful that we have academic studies which usually don't get published, which find no effect whatsoever. That women and men behave, in most studies, pretty similar to each other. That's a great study. Why are we asking so much from women on boards that the performance of a company actually has to get improved? And if we find it get worse, then isn't that not a self-reflection of the lack of experience and their exclusion and just a transition period of time which we have to address? So I want to then turn to something which I think is the important question, is that I'm fine with the belief that private property is critical, the Lockean tradition we call that, and that boards have a fiduciary relationship to make sure that that property is properly used. But at the same time, we cannot simply disregard that there is a social justice issue at stake as well, and we have to think through how much constraint should society put on the decisions of boards, which is a great corporate governance question itself. This is not a decidable question. It's not as if you can decide this by facts. This is a normative question, which you have to think about through. By normative, I mean your values, your ethics, how you see the world itself. And it's important to me to think that the courts, very often, actually interesting enough, Jiang referred to this, often make decisions of this nature through the labor courts, even when it impedes upon corporate governance issues, or they'll do it through consumer protection issues or antitrust issues. But when it comes to corporate governance, largely in the state of Delaware, as Leo Strine, the Chief Justice there, often tells us, the point of a firm, the board, is to be watchful of the financial interests of shareholders themselves. And we'll have to see what happens going forward, whether or not a Supreme Court, when they look at California, decide this is correct. But this does not mean that issue is still not important. As a corporate governance issue, this faces boards, and what their charter is, what their bylaws say, is something which is under the control of boards themselves and the shareholders to be deciding. So I've rejected a lot of the importance of evidence to this issue, and instead I put forth an idea that this is really a normative question above all. And I think we should think carefully about this relationship, about when it is that we should think that property rights themselves should be overruled, and that boards should not be run, here, forgive me for my slightly more populist tone here, should not be run by clubs. And the clubs are largely, in the area of governance, boys' clubs, truly boys' clubs. I will say that I was on an Indian board. I was the only non-Indian on that board, but there's advantages of being also excluded as well, too. So I didn't know, I wasn't privy to all the other fights which are going on in the board, which was probably just as well. Now, what is then the case I want to make to you on this? And the case I want to make to you is that there is a role with thinking through that we could possibly find a quota which actually makes sense. And the quota which came up with Norway is, and again, Jiang alluded to this, was not something I would support. And I want to explain to you why. 40%, when you get, and I try to explain this to my colleagues when we do diversity policy in our school as well. When you have small groups of 8 people, and you put in a rule of 40%, you're going to end up with 50%. And there's a reason why. Because you cannot cut people in half. It's Solomon's baby, you know? You just do not cut the baby in half. So there's an integer constraint on what you can do, which I always seems to be lost. So Norway actually has gone up far beyond 40% than the rule itself says. Oh, that's from me? I thought it was your mother. I thought it was your mother calling earlier on this. So let me tell you how I'm going to think about this. That's my son calling. This never happens in class. This never happens in class. So let me turn to some. My family, and many of you maybe like to gamble. And there's a thing called an odds ratio, which is worth thinking about. So when you put down 15% as a target, you get a 7-to-1 ratio of of men to women. Right? When you put down 20%, you get 5-to-1. 25%, you get 4-to-1. So with the same amount of increases of women, you get a declining amount of gain for how much it affects the quota itself. So the point of this should be then, we have to concede that there is something important about these property rights, and and there's something important about social justice, and find a quota which is not too high, yet sufficiently important that it affects the balance on the board itself. Because otherwise you'll be affecting property rights, or you'll be forgetting social justice. That quota is, I would say, is around 20 to 25%. And this is exactly what you find if you look at the legislation in California, and you look at particularly BlackRock, is what is being actually suggested. If you put out if boards are around 8 on average, you can adjust the argument, and you put out a minimal quota of 2 women on a board, you've already affected there a 25% odds ratio for women. You've made a very important change already in that particular board. California, I just think, wants a constitutional argument, because they only have 1 woman on the board, which it seems to me is a token argument, and it's not going to be very particularly effective. But they're looking just for a legal debate down the road itself. 2 women, 25% on the board, has nice properties because it also allows you back away from a single woman token, and also creates over time women's clubs as well. This is why it's not bad for a woman to be on multiple boards. It's actually a positive thing to be on multiple boards. It creates a body of women who are connected, and within them provides a reservoir of talent that they can find people who are experienced, increasingly more experienced, and can fill these positions themselves, which is very important. So the California ruling, I think, is symbolic. BlackRock is right. But you know, symbolism also is important, and I guess that's why Shiva got us up today to have this discussion, to point out the importance that this is an issue, no matter what the empirics are, about social justice in society and how that should affect who's on the board. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bruce. So I'm so happy to learn that we actually in agreement about this social justice issue. So my view that from the perspective of social justice, we actually should not have quota. Okay. Now, for example, suppose there's a company whose main product is cosmetics for women, and you want to add 1 more board member who's intimately familiar with the consumers and the market. Now, if the company were to have a global search for the most qualified candidate for their position, most likely that person probably will be a woman. However, if there's a guy who spent all his lifetime researching women's cosmetics and the products in the market, that guy could outshine all the other women and become the most qualified candidate for this position, and he earns the position. So out of efficiency or justice, it is what the skills are rather than which gender, what sex each candidate has. And I also did some interesting exercise. Suppose in the ideal world, man and woman are equal because there's never any prejudice. There's no historical legacy. Every man, every woman comes equally equipped for the skills for the board member, and each they enjoy exactly half of half probability to be recruited. what will happen? On average, the board will be 50% women and 50% men, but doesn't mean every board is 50-50 because the local pool, the pool of the talents at that time, at that location, etc., would have random variations across different boards. Now, if I were to solve this question mathematically, a 10-people board, if men and women have equal opportunity to the board, what is the probability that a single board, the women representation will be below 40%? That is 17%. What is the probability that such a completely fair board would have women below 30%? That will be 5%. So any quota would inevitably cut out even the most justified and fair and efficient decisions that the companies would make. So I just want to add that in. Thank you.
2 comments on this, and this is a great debate to have, and I hope you guys are enjoying it. And I think we'll probably go out afterwards and have a cup of tea over the conversation. So the issue of the efficiency of the argument, which was put out here, essentially, I reject that. I reject overall that in the situations that markets do arrive at these efficient outcomes for the same reasons we all believe in. Because we believe that if there were efficient outcomes, there simply would be more women on boards, right? I mean, as simple as that. Why would you have so much of the population excluded from a board if at birth they're born with equal abilities, have equal competences, are well-trained, et cetera, and yet, even so, in terms of a life course, we find boards which are so deprived of females. And we don't need to do a lot of this. If you look at how boards made decisions up to a few years ago, it was largely based upon boys clubs. More so in this country too, but more so in other countries as well. As far as statistics, I think this is great, on this. And I actually ran a statistic in a paper which I published on this, which showed exactly, people often say it's exactly 2 on boards, it's too low, exactly 1. But Jiang is right. There's a distribution around these things. But you can make again a low quota coming in, and you can very quickly, which is reasonable, given what the mean is already, push those numbers up very highly. And I'm thinking about normative costs. I'm not thinking about money costs. Normative costs for the principle, I want to respect private property, which I respect, but I also want to do right by social justice, allows us with low quotas to actually move this up and not have much damage to the private property principle.
Good morning, thank you. This is Sheila Hingorani, class of '94. So I'm really curious how much thinking, or when we'll look at affirmative action, does that provide a sort of base case or case study or baseline for some of the thinking around what we're thinking about gender quotas? And I too very much subscribe to your way of thought, which is, as a woman, I don't like being viewed as the woman at the office or in the workplace or in the industry, and I don't particularly care for women being promoted because they are a woman. I don't think that leads to good corporate policy, to good leadership, to good outcomes in that particular way. But on the other hand, I'm also thinking, if we subscribe and we believe that it is a boys' club, and if we do truly think that, then how do we make change? And when I think about affirmative action, we probably wouldn't be seeing the progress that's occurred if we've just let the market to its own devices. Because if you have a small select group that makes policy and makes decisions and the rules of how we play, what encourages them to change the way they think about the game? So that's my question. Thank you.
Well, I think it's a very, very good question, and we as an organization have been thinking about over the time. So I just reflect on one thing that we did. So as a vice dean for teaching curriculum, we did a random auditing of the gender composition of all the speakers, guest speakers into our class. Now, surprise, surprise, they're predominantly men. Okay. And I actually show the chart. Now, Emily saw that. We showed the chart at a full faculty meeting, and the message to the faculty members said, you haven't been trying hard enough. The reason is that you always think the obvious speakers because they're already men. The next time you see who was the speaker last time, who was the speaker last year, and you're perpetuating this trend. Now, our policy is not to tell every faculty, you must have 40% of speakers to be women. I don't think that's a good policy because topics vary, the pool vary, the time vary. However, we constantly publicize such statistics and reach out to the faculty member who never had a female speaker usually in his class. Basically say, have you been trying harder? We actually can help you to reach to a wider pool. And with this effort, this number will keep improving. I think we don't disagree the problem exists. I just don't think the quota is the way to accomplish it. The free market itself will not solve the problem. We do need a lot of nudges. Okay? And then we do need putting the bad behavior into the spotlight. And this is something the regulation or the organizations can do on top of the marketplace.
Yes, thank you. And I compliment the debaters for basically being on the same page, and I want to support this lady right here in her mentioning of rules of the game. My impression is, well, you've talked about the quantitative aspects of the issue, and I think she's getting to the qualitative issues, the rules of the game. And I think starting at birth is the place to start, but during the maturation of men, it's different from the maturation of women. And I think that's where the substance lies. Men, I think, learn the rules of the game of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. The boards are set up so that the chairman or the CEO makes a selection, builds a board in his vision, and he says, I'll be on your compensation committee as the independent director, and you be on mine as the independent director. That's the rules of the game. And I think the issue is the boards would be looking for women, but what I would say, winos. Women in name only. They think like men.
Sometimes I feel like we want to ban all aspects of human behavior, and I'll stop myself here. This is why I think it's good for people to have like a second person saying, "Stop there," don't go further than that. But you see this in life with the exchanges back and forth, and it's kind of makes things work if you wish. So you have to be kind of pragmatic on that, and we can regulate everything we want, and then we've got no flexibility and no margin to do things. And there's a concept of social capital, which is important to how these things actually work. And I think that's great, but at the same time, and I know you agree with this, there's got to be some sense of what's fair play, right? And maybe that was fair play before. We don't have to have that really argument, but it's not fair play today, right? So today it has to be different. But often it's going to come back when we are succeeding at this, and I think there's a spotlight which is making this happen. I think the quota discussion actually is pushing that into the spotlight too, and therefore is useful. But we are succeeding on this, and then we're going to find that there's going to be women and men's clubs which are existing, or there's going to be people who are richer and people who are not rich, and people who are poor and the people who are so all these things come up on these issues. So I'm being pragmatic that there's an aspect of human life which is always going to be there, and there's benefits to that as well. But in today's terms, I don't think any of us would like to be in front of a popular audience making the case for, well, we have these rules and therefore we have very low numbers of females on the board. So human behavior, yes. Social injustice sensitivity, yes, as well as I would respond to it.
Thank you. You mentioned bad behavior earlier. Don't you think the Me Too movement is having a natural effect in terms of changing the ratio, in terms of who's on boards, to prevent legal risk, lawsuits? It's all about money ultimately, including the attrition from the workplace, with women still making 75 cents on the dollar to what men make.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're winning in the selection.
I personally don't think there's any research based on data or etc. But if I just ask for my personal impression, I think the Me Too movement definitely dramatically raised awareness of gender imparity in the workplace. and about what women have gone through, have been put up with for a long time. And it's also a wake-up both on the men and women, basically certain behavior no longer need to tolerate. And people also realize such behavior in some instances massively exists because there are very, very few women in the senior place. And also some men, at least for the long tenure in their work life, they didn't view women as their peers because there are very, very few female peers among them. Hence, this cultivated that kind of behavior. So I do believe that the Me Too movement dramatically raised awareness and also lowered down the threshold for people's tolerance, as well as a demand for more female representation at the high places as to set the tone and balance out the culture.
So I just wanted to pick up on Bruce's comment about us being humans after all. And even with our best of intentions, we have to focus on sort of what's best for my family, what's best for my company. And as an example, I have many colleagues, many friends in Silicon Valley who are high-level executives. We all have daughters about the same age, so we're on the one hand all concerned about their situation. But then when we talk about, so what are you going to do to change your hiring practice on your multi-billion-dollar Silicon Valley, behemoth? It's like, well, we can't do that because we would be under competitive pressures, and we can't go and sort of dramatically increase female representation in our company and lose out to our competition. And so the argument is, yes, we need to hit this, but we can't leave it to us and be a competitive disadvantage. So I think that argues for some broad social justice policy, because this is, in a sense, a very real market failure.
Is there any information on whether women are more or less represented in family business boards than corporate boards? And what I'm thinking of is, a family, chances are that 50% boys, 50% girls. And if the board represents the shareholders, theoretically, you should have an equal representation of men and women in family business boards. Whether that happens or not, I don't know.
In fact, the private companies have, on average, much fewer women than public companies. And family firms, they're very predominantly male. That is surprising, even though each family, just by, law of numbers, they should be half girls, half boys. But private companies are even more imbalanced than public companies.
The only exception to that I might add is that if politics is your family business, we have lots of female prime ministers in India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and so on.
Just a real quick question to kind of follow up on that. Private markets become much more prevalent. Do you see that diminishing the sunshine principle that you talked about? Meaning that there's
less of the whole structure around public capital out there, the analysts and the investors, and that there's so much more private equity. Is that going to decrease the look at the boards, especially when we talk about Silicon Valley and the types of unicorns coming out of there?
So
Bruce,
if I
You go
might-
first.
If I might just add
Sure,
a
then
a piece of data to support what you're saying. The gender imbalance is actually very poor, very bad, meaning very skewed in favor of men for firms that go public recently. So if you look at IPOs, and I'm guessing many of these are PE-sponsored companies, the gender imbalance is actually horrible. And if you peel the onion back in some sense and then look at the pipeline, if you look at VC funding, the VC funding to female-based startups is disproportionately smaller compared to startups set up by men. But sorry, one of you wants to take it.
Yeah. So I think these days, you're right. I think the space of public companies are shrinking. In 2006, we had 8,000 public companies. Now we barely have 4,000. So I think that your concern is quite legitimate. So on the other hand, now there are also far more public attention on what we call the notable private companies. So even though the unicorns, the decacorns, they're still private, but they still draw a lot of public scrutiny. The reason is that there are a lot of institutional money in that space. And the progress partly is driven by institutional investors because they don't just invest money, they also want to carry certain social values with their investment. They're also putting a lot of pressure on those companies. But I agree with Shiva, currently the tech sector is probably the worst in terms of the gender composition.
Right. If I can add one word here, I just put together a case on Uber, and it was Uber is what is a private company will be a public company, and there's lots of interesting issues about that. But was surprised by how many of the public company regulations are already written into their charter. So so a lot of it already was there, in terms of the governance stuff. And it was amazing that you had this really horribly behaved, I think this is okay to say, he's not a graduate of our school, CEO, although he did grow up not far from where I grew up, so I should be careful on that. And over time, the board actually did put into things which are really important. And just like one observation, when you teach governance, and Wei and I have taught together, we've enjoyed teaching together before. I'm waiting for her to get out of the dean's office, so maybe we can do that again in the future. Is that people often think that governance is about people. It really is about institutions. And it's really about people being submitted to institutions to behave better. And I think maybe it's why in the private company issue is that institutional constraint is not sometimes felt as strong, but maybe that's changing in the future, and maybe it's being felt there as well.
Thank you. This is a comment, not a question. I rather like suggestions from both speakers. I think it would be difficult to make quotas a matter of public policy, just as a practical consideration. But I do like the idea of encouraging best practice as part of the overall governance structure. So I think the 20 to 25% that Professor Bruce suggested is great. And also the spotlight approach that Professor Jiang suggested, that's also great. And I think those could work very well together in combination, because there's sufficient public awareness that would drive the change in behavior.
I'm from Washington, D.C., and we recently had a congressional panel on women's health that was, and I'm sure you probably all saw this in the press, 12 men were deciding women's health. And I was wondering if you all had some suggestions that we could make some changes, or force them to make some changes, or encourage them to make some changes.
To be honest, these days, if I see any panel, like any panel in front of audience for more than 4 or 5 people, if they're all 5 men, I do feel an eyesore. I just feel the organizer is not doing its job, because I cannot believe that's not a single qualified woman could be part of the panel or part of the committee. So I think those things just needs to be disclosed or made public. Basically, since this happens, there's a committee of 12 men, made these certain policies. I think the moment it reaches public, people will immediately realize how outrageous it is. And we just hope that people will feel the urgency and urge to change.
I can't disagree with anything I've heard here this morning, but I'm interested in the slippery slope argument. I'm also looking at trend lines. We have a senator from Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren, who is asking, if not demanding, that there should be public sector representation on certainly Fortune 500 boards. And she feels that boards should look like America. And I'm not sure exactly what that means. Does that mean that we have 12% of the population is African American, 13% is Hispanic, 8% is Asian, 5% is gay? Does that mean that we have representation of all these various groups? I see us devolving into identity politics on an extreme level. If we have quotas as it relates to women representation on boards, where does it stop? Where do we go from here? So I think we're all sort of in a civilized argument here, in a nice civilized forum, but this is not the real world. I come from the film and theater industry. These are companies easily pressured. They're under media scrutiny. They're under the scrutiny of various groups. I've been part of film and theater organizations in which we have to hire a certain number of people who are gay, a certain number of people that are African American. I see us devolving away from the whole concept of meritocracy, of talent. And because it's an easier decision to make. Who's going to confront and say, well, that that gentleman was really supposed to be a white person, but, well, we have a very capable black actor here and who's got a great social media presence, et cetera, et cetera. So I see us moving more into the direction of pressure, identity politics. I think it's a slippery slope. I don't think it's good for this country. I don't think it's good for corporations. So I don't know if there's an answer for that, but I wanted to bring it up. Thank you.
Yeah, let me take this question on that. So, you know, we teach in these schools in a different way they teach in law schools. We have students who are more active in the discussions, and you know, the point you raise is a point which is often on the tip of everyone's tongues, if not said out directly on that. And I think everyone's trying to find their way through this conversation so we can have an honest debate and talk about these things and arrive at a good place where people feel good about that. So the way it works in the classroom is that I take on a back seat and there's an argument or debate on that, and there's a discussion among students, and you get kind of an inventory of where people stand. It's not going to be possible in a question like that to get a consensus, and it's not a scientific answer which can be done as well. But you can do exactly what you did and say, you know, and then I try to argue as well, there are costs to following certain principles which have to be respected as well on this. You know, there's a guy named Tony Marks. I'm going to give you a feel-good response on this because I like I'm from California and I like feel-good responses. Tony Marks was president of Amherst, and I don't know if you know Tony Marks. I have a high respect from the students. He often welcomes our students at their library. And Tony, you know, when he got to Amherst, was a fairly classic, traditional, you know, a liberal arts college with a very white population of students, et cetera. And what he argued for, and I give this out to you for us to think about, was that he didn't actually have to make those kinds of changes because there is a level of unfairness in society that by addressing that a little bit and by widening the population you look at, rather than forcing this thing of it's either you or me, so it works all together, is an answer. And I noticed that it's working here at the school. When I was in France, we had a very low population of women at the MBA level, about 17, 18%. We had an amazing guy, Antonio Fates from Spain, who went out there and searched more broadly, broadened the search, and within 1 to 2 years had a tremendous increase in the number of women who were highly qualified. So I accepted what you said. I think it's a really important point. I think the challenge is for us to all walk through this and come up with a kind of a better place than we started out on that. But I appreciate it.
It wasn't a coincidence, I think, that I watched the movie on the basis of sex on my flight in. So those who haven't seen that movie, it's about a woman trying to repeal all the laws which were there for 100 years, you know, for gender inequality, right? So, so I am with the argument that there was an external force driving the inequality. So if you leave it to the market forces, it may take 100 years to fix it. So you need an external force to fix it, right? I don't know if it's a quota or not, but I'm also in a job. I head a technology practice in the Europe, so I am associated with many universities. We try to go into the universities and prep the students for the future, right? And in that process, I get to talk to a lot of women, young women as well. I still find, and maybe it's just my perception, that there is a mindset problem as well, that many women, young women, they don't consider STEM as an education they want to pursue. I hear comments like, oh, I don't want to be the bunch of women in the male-dominated class. Oh, I don't think I'm going to, you know, excel in that. I naturally have an inclination towards this, that, and all of that. While a lot of these conversations are about fixing the inequality top-down, are there any opinions about how do we fix it bottom-up, change these mindsets? Should the quota be at universities? What are your opinions?
So since you talk about universities, I think in my lifetime, we experienced something that's dramatic. That's the medical school. So when I was born, I will tell which year it is, but you can figure it out. When I was born, the female representation medical school is 9%. Okay. And in 2017, 2017 was the first year that admitted female students exceeded half. And last year was the first year in the US, both the applicant pool as well as the admitted students, the female representation exceeded half. Okay? So there has been a lot of effort to convince young women to pursue a medical career and to let them know this is, if it's currently male-dominated, it doesn't need to be like that. Okay? And it's not an unsuitable career for women. Women can be very successful surgeons, doctors, internists, etc. Okay? Now, things are changing, okay, without quota, but with a lot of policy interventions and nudges and encouragement of girls and teenagers for them to consider this is a STEM major, and they funnel into the system. So I really look forward, because I think the technical aspect is not the driving force, because we recently find out that there are fewer female finance professors than mathematical female in mathematics. So clearly it's not because of the technicality. It is the mindset of people who are current decision makers, as well the overall culture that's discouraged women from entering. So I think things could be changed, because in my lifetime I already see the complete success of women that we can wholeheartedly celebrate.
My understanding is that China is the most advanced in percent of women on boards, and percent of women entrepreneurs, and percent of women billionaires, self-made women billionaires. Do you have any comment of that, or any knowledge of those statistics?
Actually, I do. We were just talking about with Yihong and Emily. So I think China recent is a very special period. One is that the only child policy was in place for from late 1970s all the way to last year. So for a whole generation of women, they only have one child. Not only they have only one child, their employers know they were going to stop after one child. Okay, so that dramatically changed both the parents' investment in their daughters and employer expectation about the female employees. So that is like one in a time in history. It's a very unusual event. And the second is that in China, we call it a grandma help. So in China, the grandmas on both sides will help raising the young children, so that both the husband and wife, they are all out and pursuing their career. So that's very, very common in China. And the sort of thing that I find is very interesting, that when I went back to China, people look at me and say, Wei, you must be twice as good as a man to be where you are, because China is still a very sexist society. So they feel like if you broke it through, you must be twice as good. Now, what I'm upset about the gender quota, that when in the US, I was approached by someone basically say, I don't need to be as good because you're a woman. So that's precisely, I feel like women in general, we don't benefit from quota. Yes.
Thanks for the great discussion. A lot of the discussion so far has been around kind of issues of equity and fairness. We haven't heard as much about the impact of having more women on boards in terms of the performance of the company. And I'd love to hear your thoughts around that, particularly in light of this article, which was one of the most fascinating things I've read recently. It's titled, Gender and Geography in the Boardroom, What Really Matters for Board Decisions.
I read that.
You've read that? Yeah, it's by Zinat Alam. And it says that it has been shown, apparently, that having more women on boards tends to increase the amount of scrutiny that boards hold the executives to, and they're better at holding the executives to account. But the argument in the article looks at the distance that women directors are from the headquarters. And apparently it's harder to find women directors, so they tend to cluster in urban centers further from the headquarters. And a lot of the impact of having women directors can be tied to that confounding factor. So what do we actually know about the impact of having more women on boards?
So I know Wei knows as much, not more than me on this, but there was a study that I think is the same one, which was interesting, was that one study I was thinking about was the California law has put such a demand for finding women going forward that they're pulling female directors from all around the country, which is having an equilibrium, as Glenn would say, as an equilibrium has the result of that there's less female directors available for elsewhere. So there's usually is kind of a sourcing nearby. You know, I will say that when you look at the United States in urban versus rural, which is kind of what you referred to, it's in everything. Everything is divided by urban versus rural. This is like more money, there's more political giving, there's more everything, which is in that divide. And that tends to be a little bit unfair in terms of having a broader representation of the U.S. population. I know we just talk about, you know, white or black or woman or female, but there is also an issue on the geography. This is really important. I think Wei and I both really like the studies done by a woman named Marianne Bertrand over at Chicago. And it's because she finds things sometimes which work in that favor of the argument, sometimes against. But a very common result of the debate is that the results often are not there as expected. Some people find it, and some people don't find that. But some of the best results don't find these results. But as I said earlier, I don't know how Wei feels about this. That's not really an argument against quotas. You know, it's nothing to do with that. You know, there's an argument which is the fairness involved in that. And two, I know you discounted that at the start, but there's not compelling empirical evidence, in my view, which says that firms have been very much hurt by this. Now, I want to make one statement. Those famous Norway studies, there was a number of firms which withdrew from public listing rather than obey this particular rule, and they relisted over in London. So sometimes when you do these studies, the samples change as well, and who's actually left on these things. I don't want to talk too much in this language, but there's probably more things going on than we can pin down. But it's not. I don't find overwhelming evidence that quotas have been very harmful to boards. You know. Wei, do you agree with that or no?
Oh, that's fine. Yeah.
She's going to give me the footnotes later on.
I just want to add one more footnote to what Bruce just said. So if you look at some of these studies which have looked at the California quota, they claim stock prices fall by about 0.5 or 0.9%. But what's more astonishing is that the average value loss per company is claimed to be $60 million.
Yeah.
So I, for the life of me, cannot understand why would having to appoint one more woman cost the company $60 million. So you have to take some of these studies with a pinch of salt.
Right, but let's go one step further. So since this is being evaluated by people in the market, are you saying they're biased in their evaluations?
Could be, but you know, stock prices have lots of noise, so it's sometimes hard to look at performance and understand what's the root cause behind some of these statistics.
Right.
Is this working?
Yeah.
So I get a little frustrated with the performance question because it would be great if you could write an article about what's the value of having men on boards.
Yeah.
I mean, do you know what I mean? Like, why are we having this
Right.
discussion? It's having intelligent, trained people on the board, and half of the population, or more than half, graduating universities are female. I mean, how do we curate experiences to drive a pipeline of top talent for boards? And I think I've organized a number of conferences, and I've been in the energy industry. So in general, I'm usually like 1 to 40 in a room. So it's actually quite hard to find people who have that skill set, because you don't really just wake up knowing how to speak, knowing how to get those experiences as you go through your career. So I'd be curious what the school is doing to curate more experiences for people to practice at leadership levels, perhaps a board trainee program, or something that actually could pull from the talent pool that we have to give experiences that could lead you on your career path to a board director position, or if you've seen anyone do something like that.
Well, it's a good time to plug one of our new exec ed programs. So, so we are launching one exactly along those lines in September. So if you look at the marketplace, our competition is Stanford and Harvard. Stanford has a fairly good executive education program. Harvard has one specifically directed at women on boards. There's one at Wharton and Kellogg. But in terms of the broader question about admission and so on, maybe you're probably better qualified to respond to that in terms of what we're doing at the MBA level.
Yeah, so we now basically look at different clubs, student clubs that target different industries. We are conscientiously do constant self-auditing to see all kind of balances of diversity, not just on gender, but along social economic backgrounds and everything. And whenever we see a clear clustering of one particular group, predominance of one particular group, now we ask ourselves why this is happening. What is a good reason behind this? Okay, and usually there's not a good reason behind such singularity. And then the question is, how do we open the door and make more people to be aware of this and get them into the door? Because the experience is very self-perpetuating. Once you have experience, you have more experience. So as you said, I completely agree with you, is to expose people, all kinds of people, give them the opportunity to gain the experience. I also completely agree with you. I don't think that to improve a corporate governance, improve corporate performance should be the standard for women to be on board, because we never do research whether adding another guy, what is the value for the corporation. I think that's very, very misguided. Unless there's evidence, say, adding a woman, that definitely destroy value, I might reconsider. But otherwise, I think everybody is on par, and especially we want to grow people from the base level and constantly doing the auditing at which level there's an unbalanced attrition, and we want to address that.
Well, don't run that study on the faculty of the business school, so.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Rashmi tells me we're out of time officially. So, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you.